Perhaps I should escort you both back to Karen. Do you truly need to go into this place?
Bean asked, with his half-absent voice, to the pair of them after they stood locked in place for a long moment in awe of the tower. The black tower was like a missing piece of the horizon. Where all else was a pale, dead, white wasteland, it stood in defiance and ownership over this land. Medea struggled to find her voice.
It feels so. I don't know if I can even move. I have never felt anything like this. There's just waves of...
She shook her head, unable to find the words. Her staff was held tight in her hands, and she was leaning on it heavily. Chesney felt it too. Some force at work in this part of the world that felt like he was standing in the middle of 100 insect hives, desperate to not make a sound, like a single step would mean certain destruction. Should they turn back? He seriously considered it. Whatever was in that tower was beyond deadly, possibly worse than anything they'd faced so far. But if they gave up, what would that really mean? Would Zagos get his undead army? Would the rest of the world look like this? In time? What kind of madman would allow something like that? If it was anyone other than Zagos, he wouldn't believe it. But if his people were anything to go by, Zagos would be an infinitely more ruthless tyrant. Nothing would be too far for him. He looked down at his feet, where they had stood for the last 2 minutes, just touching the bleached white dirt this place. The silence of this land was terrifying. Freezing, stagnant air hung about them, making it just on the edge of painful to breathe, so they only allowed themselves shallow breath. Just take the step, Shades. You can do it. We believe in you. We're so proud of you, Chesney. You can do this. His breath caught in his chest. He snapped his head to the side, expecting to see something. Tail and Samza, smiling at him, maybe. But there was nothing. That didn't stop a tiny mote of warmth in his heart, even from just imagining their support for him in this awful place. Medea caught the movement in his near unreadable expression.
What is it? And don't say it's nothing.
He swallowed, just to get some moisture in his throat to speak.
I heard them just now. Tail. And Samza.
She was surprised. It had been ages since he had one of these hallucinations. Not that she could blame him for having a relapse in a place like this. It made her worried, though, that the tower was affecting him more deeply. It was an awful place to have a relapse. She put a hand on his arm.
What did they say?
He took a breath and gave her a reassuring look.
They said we can do this. We just have to take a single step and start.
That was a surprise. Before, the visions had always been so accusatory. But in this place, could it really be them? She looked surreptitiously over to Bean. He stared at her impassively with that gaze that seemed to look always off into the infinite. You're no help.
Then, come on. If they believe in us, we owe it to them to try, right?
She wasn't sure if playing into these visions of his was the right thing to do, but right now, it felt right. He nodded, took her hand, and they both stepped into the dead, white landscape together. All at once, the gravity of the place took on a different feeling entirely. Now, no longer struck between the twin pulses of Paladin, begun, and come to me. All that was left was the latter. Each step towards the thing became faster, easier. Like all the great pressure that had been building upon them was being blown away the closer they were to the tower. The muffled quiet of the air up until now abated, and now each step through the crunching dead soil sounded like a rock slide. Strangely, despite how far away the tower had seemed from Forest's edge, it grew quickly in their sight as they walked. It was like their strides were 3 times greater, or that space somehow warped their perceptions of distance and time. Each step just felt like inevitable gravity, pulling them ever forward, faster and faster. Until, at last, they stood before the great black edifice. The dull white dirt that piled at its base did nothing to brighten the surface of it. Now that they were this close, they could see that the tower was not actually perfectly circular, but was slightly oblong. The doors to it were enormously tall, 4, perhaps 5 times their height, and proportionally wide as well. They were completely undecorated, just smooth black stone, with 2 enormous pull rings to open them. Chesney's hand hovered over the ring, afraid that something would happen the moment he touched it.
Come on, we'll do it together,
Medea said, at his side. He looked to find her smiling, and already holding her ring.
On 3. 1, 2, 3.
They both heaved at the doors, straining against the massive weight. Slowly, the seam between them cracked open and widened. Part of him expected some evil blackness to come pouring out, but there was nothing like that. No howling, or moaning. All was dark, and silence. The two let go of the now wide-open doors, and stepped in front of the yawning black opening. The pale white light of the outside illuminated some outlines of the structure within. Debris, walls, stairs. Nothing stirred. Bean moved between them, sword out. He seemed once more very much more alive now that his sword was in his hand. His movements more real and fluid.
On your guard, little Nasquat children. Always be watchful, and listen.
They each held their weapons and followed him inside. The bottom floor was huge, but somewhat austere. Though it was impossible to say for sure, it seemed like it had been something between a fortress and an outpost. Here and there on the floor were torn wisps of heavy cloth, or bits of armor. The floor and walls were all black stone, but this time the walls were decorated with carven murals that seemed to have been worn down over time by dust and wind and sand. Here and there, near the windows that were actually more like arrow slits, were piles of white sand that must have blown in over the millennia. The rest of the internal structure of the tower appeared to be wood. To the right was a huge collected pile of wooden refuse that seemed to be a combination of floorboards and stairs. In the central area, wooden debris that could have been desks or bookshelves or weapon racks. There had been walls, but they'd long since crumbled, and to the left a mostly intact set of stairs leading upward. And still all was damnably silent.
Are you seeing anything, Bean? Medea whispered, still not quite ready to step any further inside. The air is thick with spirits here. I cannot make out one from another in this place. It is a sea of faces and thoughts and anger.
Though he was loath to do it, Chesney said,
Okay, let's take a quick look around the bottom floor here. Remember, we are looking for something called glow seeds. Should we split up and cover more ground?
Medea scoffed.
Not on your life, Chesney. Imagine, suggesting we split up in a place like this.
He nodded.
Yeah, not my brightest idea. Let's have a look under all this splintered wood.
They walked over to the piles of debris and began to sift through it. Mostly all they found were insect carcasses and wood dust up.
Let's check out all this pile on the right. It looks less decayed,
Medea suggested, pulling them to the wrecked staircase. Looking up in the dim light afforded by the entrance, they could see a stairway had indeed connected to the floor above, but most of that floor had fallen apart and was nothing more than a collection of loose boards over some stronger beams. The pile of debris here was much heavier to work with, but soon they felt that whatever was under this rubble wasn't what they were looking for. Just then, they heard a sound, a rustle. Whipping around, they found a book floating in the air, and right by it, an oddly glowing little crackling ball of something. The book was floating, open, and every few moments a page would turn. The ball thing was bright around the edges, and dark inside with small unidentifiable shifting shapes within. The book looked positively ancient, and every page flip caused more dust and paper pieces to fall away. Medea yelped, but mostly kept quiet when she clamped her hand over her mouth. She whispered,
Do you think it's trying to show us that book? Is it important?
Slowly, as if it heard her question, the book slowly rotated to show them the decayed writing. The book snapped shut, turned again, and flipped back open, and flipping through the pages even faster. Then snapped shut once more, and open, flipping through the pages once more like snapping playing cards.
I see you. Just hold on.
Cautiously, She stepped closer and reached out her hands.
Here, Jay, just give it to me.
The book stopped being flipped through and moved slightly in her direction before stopping. The glowing ball seemed to flicker, and the book faltered a bit before rising once more.
Oh, okay. I can grab it.
She slowly crept closer, feeling like any sudden movements would wake the whole of the place. She reached out her hands and gently grabbed the tattered tome. Just as she pulled it close to look at the cover and text, the glowing ball sputtered sparks, jerked erratically, moved towards her and exploded in a shower of fire, smoke, and sparks. Medea was blasted 4 body lengths away, and plowed through the jagged wood debris. Pages fluttered to the ground or burned all around them. The next moment, Chesney ran to her side.
Medea, are you okay?
At first she didn't move, but then twitched and gasped awake. She quickly tried to stand, but then promptly fell back to the ground, and vomited. Chesney held her hair out of the way, then helped her to the ground again.
That was a bad explosion. Don't try to get up. Can you use the crown?
Her eyes were unfocused.
Explosion. I don't. Ang. Too bright. I can't.
He was hardly an expert, but this seemed like a really bad concussion. He grabbed at his belt, fumbling for the lid of his ibuprofen. Bean stood at their side, weapon at the ready, staring all about.
Things are waking up here now. I suggest we do not tarry.
With one hand holding her head, and his other deftly digging out a pill, he pressed it into her mouth and hoped she wouldn't vomit it back up immediately. Thankfully, it seemed to work instantly. She winced for just a second as something inside her healed, and sat up.
What happened? Why am I on the ground? There was this weird glowing ball thing, and when you got too close, it exploded. I think you got a really bad concussion.
She shook her head, and winced as a headache seemed to be forming.
Stupid. Why would I go near it?
She had a sour look on her face that didn't improve much after taking out some water and washing out her mouth.
It used a book to lure you in,
he explained. Sighing, she said,
Yeah, that would probably do it.
The silence that had prevailed in this black tower was now replaced with whispering sounds, the sounds of rustling, quiet giggling. They turned all about looking for the source. The sounds seemed to be coming from all around. We should get moving, Chesney said, but then noticed Medea leveling a trembling finger at him. Sudden realization made him turn to look behind him. There was another strange, transparent, blob-like creature. It was an indistinct blob, pale blue, with 2 huge bulbous eyes. They were comically looking off in 2 different directions. The appearance would be cute under other circumstances, but something about it seemed far more sinister. It floated there behind him, making little chirp noises, until suddenly it looked him in the eyes, and then emitted a horrendous scream. Bean was there in a flash, his blade like a ribbon of light in the dark, slicing the spectral form in half to cut off the scream. But instead, it split into 2 copies, and then darted away out of sight, giggling like children. The noise, though, had done something. The ghosts of the place now seemed fully roused. From the floor and ceiling, things came out from nowhere. A half-dozen spitting and sparking glowing orbs from above descended silently and erratically out of the ceiling. Armored hands clawed at their feet from newly appeared headless horrors. Screeching laughter came from floating heads, dripping spectral blood on the floor. They were surrounded, and swarmed. Chesney's first instinct was to run, but at the last moment he caught himself. If they ran, who knows what they would run into? No, they had to clear the way, or end up flanked.
Just blast them with everything you've got,
he yelled, turning his back to Medea and Bean, bracing himself for anything.
Oh, okay,
she called back, and they pressed their backs together. At once, the whole bottom floor was engulfed in a roaring inferno, and a clawing web of lightning bolts jumping to everything moving except them. An incredible wave of devastation rocked their enemies. Glowing orbs popped, armor cracked and flaked away, and floating heads screamed and dissolved. but not all of them. What remained seemed to be boiling away whatever spectral energy kept them anchored to this world, but they still lingered where the others had faltered. Bean wasted no time and leapt to keep the headless from rising. Sword slices snapped out faster than Chesney could follow, dismembering arms or legs. Quick kicks would force back the ones that had not yet regained their footing. But there were too many just for him to focus on. A pair of them found Chesney and Medea distracted and plunged broken swords at their legs. The attack worked, and they both fell to the ground, holding blood from wicked gashes and crying out. As one, a group of the disgusting floating heads chanted together, and the trio was engulfed in a firestorm of their own. They both screamed in pain, rolling on the floor trying to extinguish the fire, while Bean seemed to instead dim and drip some spectral essence. While the two of them regained their footing, Bean flipped and cut two of the heads down. A glowing orb found his back when he landed, and exploded him across the room. The rest of the glowing orbs descended on Chesney and Medea, and they had just a fraction of a second to put up their guards before being blown even farther. Chesney rolled to his feet, trying to make use of the momentum. He shouted,
"Again!" before they close in,
and thrust out his hands for another firestorm. Medea, still prone, coughed,
"Okay,"
thrust out her hand, and bathed the remaining forces in another cascading web of electric bolts. This time, all the remaining headless heads and glowing souls crackled out of existence, and they had a second to collect themselves. The reprieve didn't last long, however. All throughout the tower they could hear howling and laughing and crying and cackling. Chesney and Bean helped Medea to her feet. Their arms trembled from the pain of moving their fire-scorched skin. She shook her head, saying,
"We won't make it if the rest of our encounters go that badly."
It drained her emotionally, but she used the crown's power to take the edge off the damage to them. She turned to Bean.
"You look worse for wear, too. Can I even heal you? I am losing some of my will and integrity." "Yes,"
he said, looking at the odd glowing wounds on his person, mixed in with the crimson red of the splotches on his armor.
"As for if I can be healed, I do not know."
Awkwardly, she took his hand and concentrated. "Please, Sophie, heal this being." Miraculously, his form seemed to solidify once more.
"Well, I'll be,"
he said, wonder in his voice for the first time since they'd met him. His face was far more animated now, and his limbs moved in the most lifelike way yet.
"I haven't felt like this since, well, I can't even recall."
The surprise quickly gave way to caution as the noises at the bottom floor seemed to intensify. Bean said, calmly but sternly,
"We need to move up, or we'll get swarmed again."
Nodding, they ran up the stairs to the second floor. Oddly enough, the floor was only half the size of the tower, with a huge brick wall bisecting the two halves. There was no door to the other side, which meant this side of the floor was very cramped, especially filled as it was with undead creatures.
"Keep them in front of us,"
Chesney yelled, brandishing his sword beside Bean. Two sword slashes came crashing down from two headless to either side. Chesney blocked his with his shield, while Bean flicked his sword, whacking the hand of the headless and knocking the sword out of its hand. Medea took the moment to use her magic to speed everyone up. For her trouble, an unseen enemy from above blasted her with a bolt of lightning, and she stumbled back and almost fell down the stairs. Chesney turned in concern for her. She blinked back tears and waved him away.
"I'm fine. Watch out."
For his distraction, the headless near him punched him in the helmet with its armored hand, knocking him into Bean, who stood fast, and pushed him back to his feet easily. Pushing forward, Medea spied what had attacked her, a horrible floating thing, like a skull, but squirming with tentacles and hateful eyes. She jabbed her arm forward.
"Break!"
And it slammed into the wall, leaving a greasy stain. Just then, more childlike giggling, and one of the goofy-eyed blobs flew from one wall to the other, spreading some kind of force on the undead things in the room. They now seemed to be glowing with powerful light that seemed to burn from them like smoke. Chedsney was astonished when he took a solid swing at one of the headless that seemed wide open, only to find his sword barely cut 2 inches into the armor.
Damn it! What did that thing just do? Here, this will help,
Medea said, and pressed her hand to Chedsney, granting him the super strength that earth and sky could give. The tentacled thing blasted her once more with lightning, and Bean answered by kicking up a fallen sword and throwing it right through the eye of the thing, pinning it to the wall, until it slowly dissolved in black smoke.
Thanks, Bean,
she said, to which he nodded.
Basil, I have missed you. I feel more alive now than I have in a century,
Bean cried, taking on a group of flying heads, cutting them down, though he took many awful bites to his face and arms for the trouble. Chedsney, once he was finished with the creatures on his side, pushed forward and said,
Is there no end to these? More are coming from the walls,
Medea cried, pointing to another group of sparking souls coming from beside them. She thrust out her hand, and great bolts of lightning extinguished them before they could explode.
Chedsney,
she gasped between gulping breath.
We need to keep going up, or we will get pinned down and overwhelmed. Right. Bean, charge with me. Medea, keep close.
He brought up his shield, stood shoulder to shoulder with the ancient ghost, and rushed through the remaining headless and floating heads to reach around to the next staircase, slashing at any easy targets they could get. The 3rd floor was hardly any better. Cut in half like the previous floor was, it was cramped and filled with ethereal forms coalescing from nothingness and glowing maliciously. Frustrated, Chedsney cried out,
That's enough of this,
and thrust his hands out in both directions, filling the cramped space with roaring red fire that turned blue, and then white as it consumed and seared everything in sight. When he was done, the smell of ash filled the air and he collapsed momentarily to the floor. Almost everything in the room was destroyed, save for 2 buzzing souls that just emerged from the wall. Quickly floating down to his faltering form, Bean dashed up, slicing one clean through, destroying it, and taking the explosion meant for Chedsney from the other. Medea dragged Chedsney away from the stairwell, and with the little bit of reprieve his attack had given them, fished out 3 ibuprofen and administered them to all of them. Again, she wasn't sure if the medicine would help a being like Bean, but to her shock it had the same effect as Sophie's crown had. She had no explanation for why it would work, but it was hardly the time to sit around speculating.
I don't think we can afford to keep letting these encounters drag out. Chedsney,
Medea said, her voice raspy and desperate for a drink.
Yeah, I know. But we either rush past them and take tons of hits, or we go all out and drain ourselves half to death from the magic strain. Well, if those are the only 2 options, I know what my vote will be,
she growled.
This place is really pissing me off. I've been stabbed, burnt, electrocuted, exploded, and I'm about ready to lose it.
Just then, another horrible tentacled thing snarled as it oozed out of a nearby wall. Angry now, Medea yelled,
Break,
and slammed her fist into it, splattering it completely before it dissolved into nothing.
Come on,
she yelled, stomping around the corner and getting to the next stairwell. Chedsney and Bean exchanged a shocked look and ran to her side. At the top of the stairs were a group of floating heads and buzzing souls.
I can explode things too, you know.
She poured out a handful of bomb pellets and threw them upward. The whole tower shook from the force of the explosion, and the creatures were obliterated in light and smoke. Dust filled the air, and the tower felt like it was rumbling and crashing and falling apart.
I don't think the tower liked that,
Chedsney cried, staggering from the shuddering floorboards, though Medea proceeded upwards undaunted. Bean also looked about with something approaching fear.
No, it did not like that at all, in more ways than one. Meaning? In short, it's really pissed off.
In a flash, 2 headless appeared from nowhere once she reached the 4th floor and each swung at Medea's head. Yelping, she ducked, and used her staff to trip them both. With super strength, she bashed the chest plate of one until it caved in, and then blasted the other with a massive bolt of lightning. She screamed a curse and kicked the wall.
Medea, calm down,
Chesney said, grabbing her shoulder when she went to kick the wall again. She snapped her head to him, rage in her eyes.
No, I will not. Calm down. I'm tired of this awful place. This tower, this region, this whole country. I'm tired of being hurt. I'm tired of feeling scared. I'm tired of risking my life for people who don't care about me. I'm tired of wondering if I'll ever see my dad. Whoa, hey, it's okay.
Chesney started, but she slapped his hand away when he went to try to hug her. She shut her eyes and breathed in sharply. It sounded like she was on the verge of sobbing or screaming, but at the last moment, her breath came out slowly, and a face etched in deep emotion was instead replaced with one in cold fury.
No. Not right now. Not while we're here. Later, I'll cry and talk. But right now, I want to stay angry.
Chesney was really not at all sure letting her stay in this state was going to be healthy or helpful, but he had no clue what else to do. It hurt him to see her on the edge like this, but he managed to look her in the eyes and nod.
Okay. Later. For now, we fight. I'm with you.
He brought his sword up and tapped his chest with it for good measure.
Yeah, we fight hard. All the way to the end, you and I,
she said, thickly, grabbing her staff in a white-knuckle grip. He especially didn't like how she said, the end. Moore and Dead were ascending the stairs below them, and they both turned.
Bolt.
The entire group was vaporized. In the meantime, 4 spectral-looking Fiorilla in familiar face masks coalesced right in the path of the next flight of stairs, with another giggling, googly-eyed blob swirling overhead. Medea's breath caught in her throat, and she dropped her staff.
No.
The things looked exactly like the assassins that had assailed them in the dark after the Helm Temple, same clawed hand stance and all.
Oh, Sophie, no, please.
With an awful laugh, the chittering blob swirled around and did something to the assassin specters that made them solid and brighter, then flew away through the wall. Seeing her reaction, Chesney instantly put together what these things were. When they had attacked in the night, he had been the first to go down, and it had torn a hole in his heart to hear how Medea had needed to fight for her life almost single-handedly. He had never seen them himself. Now, looking at them, they looked terrifying and ready to kill. He paused for a fraction of a second, looking between the assassins and Medea. While he desperately wanted to rush to her and help her, there was no way Bean would be able to keep them from advancing all on his own. But he could.
Bean, protect her,
he yelled, and dashed forwards.
What? And no, Chesney, don't.
Medea stammered, shaking and unable to move as she watched Chesney run into a death trap while she was helpless in her own terror. Chesney had fought many people who had been trained to fight and kill before, but now, against these for spectral assassins, he truly understood what it meant to face killers, people whose entire being was focused entirely on ending life, quickly and efficiently, brutally. He discovered very quickly that he was in over his head. Like they had done the same maneuver hundreds of times, the first specter grabbed his arm mid-swing, killing the momentum of his attack, while another kicked his shield. Instantly, he was exposed. A clawed fist struck squarely at his chest, but the strange power of the armor pushed it to the side. The surprise from the specter was enough for him to wrench his arm away and back up a step. But every trade of blows ended with him losing another inch, another step. His swordplay was clean, and his stance sure, but the assassins were experts at deflecting the energy of his attacks and forcing his movement. He had one sword, and one shield, and there were 8 hands, all ready to kill him instantly if he so much as made one mistake. He wondered how in the world Medea had survived. It was then that one catapulted over the fight in an incredible flip and wall kick, and made straight for Medea and Bean. The distraction was enough to pin him down from being able to make chase.
Bean, stop him.
The ancient warrior was between the assassin specter and Medea in a blink, sword flashing in the dark, clashing with the clawed hands in a deadly dance. His sword techniques were impeccable, but it seemed these assassins had trained specifically to deal with people wielding swords. Medea saw all of this. Chesney, fighting desperately against three, and being a step away, protecting her from the fourth. Her body remained frozen in fear, unable to stop remembering the night the assassins had attacked and nearly killed them all, the horror of fighting for her life all alone against murderers, and the despair and grief of crying at Chesney's side, thinking he had died. It was all happening again, right before her eyes, and yet she could not move, could not act to save them when they needed it. Her heart screamed at her to grab her staff, to stand, to fight, to not let tragedy repeat. But her body would not listen. Bean managed to cut down one of his opponent's arms, but paid for it with an opening that let his opponent strike him down in a single blow. The ghostly warrior flickered and collapsed, unmoving. There was nothing left between them now, and the assassin specter dove at her, hollow eyes blazing with hateful light.
No!
She and Chesney screamed at once. An instant later, a sword pierced the specter's head, and it flashed away with a pop, letting the sword clatter to the floor. Chesney, in his desperation, had thrown his only weapon to save her, and now he was defenseless. Arms wrapped around his limbs, trapping him, bringing him to the ground, leaving him wide open for the final blow. No, 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 no! I can't! She screamed wordlessly, and everything turned to light and lightning. A part of her beyond conscious thought and reason was in control, and indiscriminately blasted everything. She screamed, Cherney screamed, and the assassins hissed and bubbled and exploded and disappeared. When her terror had been spent, she had collapsed on the floor, panting for breath at the exertion. She hardly felt it. Instead she crawled, almost like an animal, over to her partner. As soon as they saw each other, they both asked if the other was okay, though it mostly came out as an emotional babble. Both were beside themselves in worry and panic. Deeply shaken by the rapid-fire experience, Chesney couldn't properly form words. Everything was a blur of fighting until he saw her in danger. But that one moment, Medea cowering in fear with the specter diving towards her with its clawed hand, was burned clear as crystal into his mind. The next thing he knew, his sword was there in the thing, and he was tackled to the floor. Then all was white and pain. It took him a few more moments to recognize that there was a sound going on, and that it was Medea, babbling apologies over and over and touching him and healing his burns. When he looked in her eyes, they were dark and watery, and like she was not completely aware. He fought with her to grab her wrists.
Hey, stop. It's okay. Calm down. Stop.
After a few moments of struggle, she stopped trying to wrench free and gained a bit of her sense back.
Okay, are you with me? Are you hurt?
He asked, looking into her eyes.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
She began to say, but was interrupted by Chesney placing a finger to her lips.
Medea, it's okay. You don't need to explain. But we're still in danger right now, so I need to know if you're hurt. No. I think I'm okay,
she said, after feeling about her body.
Okay, can you try to stand?
She did, and was able to get to her feet without any assistance. He was going to say something else, but this time she interrupted him with a finger to his lips.
And before you ask, yes, I can go on. And no, that's not up for discussion.
He was not at all pleased with that answer, but this was not a place to argue, so he let it go with the plan that he would not let her be far away.
Okay, then, let's see what can be done for Bean.
Like a pool of thick shadows clumped on the floor, Bean's actual condition was impossible to predict or understand. Cautiously, like she half expected her hand to push right through him if she were not careful, she placed a hand over his body and tried to focus some of the healing force of the crown into his form. Incredibly, he solidified and gained some light to his dim, flickering form. He did not stir, And so this time, she found another dose of ibuprofen and slipped it between his cold lips. Dimly, like a 1,000-year-old statue that remembered it could move, Bean's eyes opened. His movements were slow and methodical, and individual. No two parts of his body moved at the same time, like he could only focus on moving one thing at a time again.
You know, for a moment, it was like I could almost hear them calling,
he said dreamily, like he was talking to himself. Then, the light seemed to fill his eyes once more, and he looked around confused like he had forgotten why he was here. Just as slowly and deliberately, Medea knelt down, grasped the flickering, shadowy sword that he had dropped, and put it in Bean's hands. It brightened and stopped flickering.
There. Do you feel more yourself now?
Bean turned the sword over in his hands, then slowly nodded.
Yes. That was a curious experience, young miss. For a time I felt very lost and tired. I very much think that should such happen again, I would not last in this world.
She bowed her head.
I'm sorry, Bean.
He shook his head.
We are all here, and whole. That is enough. More to the point, though, we are still in danger. Let us make haste.
They moved on, up the next staircase. While they walked, Chesney couldn't help but say something in appreciation for the man, and his skill.
You're amazing with that sword, Bean. The way you disarmed that headless, and the way you could stand your ground against that assassin in such a cramped space. Incredible. All I could do was keep them back with huge, clumsy sword swings, and I was still losing ground.
The old man's eyes flashed in sudden awakening.
Ah, yes. I've been watching you fight, young man. When we are away from here, there is some instruction I could give.
When they reached the 5th floor, they were all relieved to find that it was the top. Also, the room they were now in once again occupied the full space of the tower floor, unlike the rooms below which had been bisected by a brick wall. The walls were all covered in arrow fortifications and letting in some wanlight, and the wooden floor seemed to be at a very slight incline, dipping down towards the opposite side of the room. The floor was littered with ancient equipment long since rotted away, splintered wood, and iron bars. Chesney nudged one of the bars with his boot.
Was this a prison or something? Could be, but it could have also been just for storage,
Medea said.
You think? Well, those glow seeds were here for a reason, whatever they are. Well, we're running out of tower. They've got to be nearby.
Then, they heard it. Childlike giggling. A fog of pale blue mist seemed to bubble up from the floor below them too. Medea steeled her grip on her staff.
Where are they? I can't see them?
Chesney could see nothing, even with the fog only up to their ankles. The giggling was coming from nowhere in particular. Wanting to try something he'd been pondering for a while, he closed his eyes and tried to focus on the spirits within him. If they could only see the specters and ghosts because they were spiritualists, it stood to reason there was something inherent to the connection that allowed them to detect them. He turned his head slowly this way and that, trying to shut out the outside world and focus, trying to feel something beyond.
There,
he shouted, turned around and slashed with his sword. One of the giggling blobs had been right behind him, and screeched in anger at being attacked. The sword cut through it cleanly, but it also split the thing in two again.
Damn it! I should have used magic.
It was too late for regret, though. The two of them went wailing down the length of the room, and more spectral forms began to appear from the walls, ceiling, and floor.
Chesney, let's just blast them with everything we have, and make a run for it,
Medea said, standing at his side and giving him a determined look. He tilted his head.
Hold on, I don't trust this fog. Let's steadily march forward, and blast anything that moves. Okay, got it. I'll be right beside you,
she said, holding out a hand.
Guard our backs, Bean,
he ordered as he put up his hands. The spectral swordsman moved behind them with silent grace, now that he had his sword once more. The fog boiled around their chests now, and from within it came strange wails, lights, and shadows. It was impossible to tell what they were even fighting, but it didn't matter. Anything moving up here was an enemy. They began to march, steadily, and stopped for nothing. Two headless emerged first, and were blasted apart by twin chain lighting spells. Behind those, a flurry of dancing, sparkling lights emerged, instantly were engulfed by flames, and the two remaining were picked off by twin break spells. The next assault came from their sides, with a trio of vicious floating heads beside Midia, and two skull octopus things next to Chesney. Midia put a reflective barrier around herself in time to divert a blast of fire from the chanting heads, and Bean and Chesney impaled an octo thing each. Midia finished off the screaming heads with another blast of lightning.
"How we doing?"
Chesney asked during a small lull in the attacks.
"I'm fine. I've got plenty of juice left."
Then, two more headless attacked from behind, but Bean effortlessly parried the attacks, disarmed them of their weapons, and knocked them to the floor where their armors broke apart into dust. Distracted for that moment, Chesney didn't notice until too late that he was about to walk into a wall of bars.
"Ow!"
he cried, after hitting his knee solidly into one bar. He stopped moving and cradled his knee.
"Wow. Okay. That really hurt."
A buzzing soul floated between the bars, but Midia caught sight of it.
"Break!"
she yelled, whacking it with her staff and popping it into a harmless flash of light.
"Thanks,"
he said through gritted teeth.
"Sorry about that. What is this wall? Are we stuck in here?" "I can't see enough to know,"
Midia replied, tugging on a bar and finding it stiff and unmoving.
"Let's see if we can go around it."
They marched clockwise around the obstacle, and found that it eventually bent 90 degrees and didn't completely cut off the passage further east. It was then Chesney noticed something familiar, and got a little excited. His voice was so filled with wonder it was like he completely forgot where he was.
"Midia, do you see that?"
He pointed through the bars at a flashing green light.
"How can you still get this excited about those emergency chests?"
She sighed, though she smiled in amusement, finding his excitement infectious.
"How could I not be? They always have something cool in them. And you can't tell me that's not 100% where the seeds are." "You are probably right. Let's hope there's a door or something."
They kept following further around the enclosed space, hands touching the bars. Eventually, it curved again, and they followed.
"Whoa!"
Chesney said, staggering slightly.
"Watch out. There's some loose boards here."
Proceeding a bit more carefully, they got all the way around and indeed found a door into the barred-off area. As it turned out, there were actually two chests there, one having been more dirty and harder to see the light of. Greedily, Chesney groped at the front of one of the capsules until he found the release, and it snicked open like an iris once more. Midia took the other. The fog still made it hard to see, so he grumbled a bit as he swished his hands all around the inside.
"Well, what did you find?"
she asked, hiding something behind her back as she leaned closer. He stood back up, and showed her a spiritualist card for Sphere.
"I found one of these. What about you?"
he asked, trying to get a peek behind her. Dejectedly, she showed him a card for Sky.
"Darn. Was hoping you would have found something a little more useful."
He shook his head.
"Well, now I'm confused. Where could the glow seeds possibly be? Could they just not be here anymore? Was this all for nothing?"
Midia thought about this for a moment.
"No, I don't think they're gone. If they were, you'd expect to find empty chests up here, not full ones." "Well then, where do we even look next?" "Remember that the lower floors were cut in half? Maybe there's a set of stairs down." "Right. I forgot that the ground floor stairs upwards on that side had collapsed. All right, let's take a look around and watch." "Whoa!"
he said, making his way out of the caged area, but was interrupted by him stepping into a void where he expected a floor and found none. Taken so by surprise, he was unable to grab at anything on the way down, and fell soundly on the floor below.
"Chesney!"
Midia screamed. taking a moment to understand what happened, and trying to peer through the fog to the floor below.
Are you hurt? Where are you?
He coughed and cursed before replying.
I'm okay. I broke my fall with my bones. I'm coming right down. Don't move.
She more carefully climbed down through the hole, being sure to swing over to a spot she was sure Chesney was not laying. Bean simply floated down. She checked him over, and found that he hadn't broken anything.
You seem okay. Can you move?
He groaned.
Yeah, just give me a second.
Slowly he got to his feet.
I'm going to be feeling that for a while, I think.
She sighed in relief.
Yeah, I don't know if this headache is going away anytime soon either. Let's see if we can find the stairs.
The fog, and overall character, in this part of the tower was somehow more ominous than they'd experienced so far. The light bluish tinge to the fog had given way to something dark and gray, and the screaming and wailing and rattling that they'd heard up until now seemed altogether very far away. Rather than making them feel safer, it only left them feeling more isolated. Chesney turned to the ancient swordsman, finding him slowly turning his head all about.
Is there something different about this part of the tower? Yes, and no.
He tried.
It is not easy to explain. It is less full here, and yet it feels more intense too. One thing is certain, we must not tarry here long.
He was right, though. The presence of other specters seemed to be quite absent on this half of the floor. Chesney hoped it was because they had thinned out their numbers on the way up, but the hair on his neck was standing on end.
Don't need to tell me twice. Watch your step in this damn fog, too, Medea.
She knew all too well what he was worried about. The floorboards here were awfully loose and warped. She could see dark splotches along the floor that could either be detritus or totally open void. It was almost impossible to tell. Every step felt like it could send her through the floor. Eventually, she saw a small blinking light off in the corner.
Over here, look.
She led them towards it, carefully avoiding the darkened areas in a circuitous route, though even then she felt a few boards move when she put her weight on them and almost fell backwards into an open pit. When they got to the light, there was another emergency container, in which they found another bottle of ibuprofen, bringing their stores of the wonder drug up to 3 bottles worth.
Wow, we're practically a pharmacy at this point. Still, no sign of the seeds though.
Chesney worriedly looked above them.
I hope we didn't pass them by somewhere.
The thought of having to make another trip through the tower to make sure made him shudder.
Well, there's 2 more floors below where it could be. Let's hope for the best,
Medea said, dusting her knees off. It was then that she was distracted by a flitting shape out of the corner of her eye. She whipped around to see it, only to find another goggle-eyed, blob-shaped ghost right in front of her face. Surprised, she gasped and fell backwards, falling over the chest awkwardly. The thing gave a light, melodic, childlike chuckle. Quickly, it was joined by another, and another, coming from the walls, and through the floor. The laughing became louder, and the blobs started to dance around each other and swirl. More came, and more, laughing and dashing through each other, their eyes looking more and more hateful with every passing moment. Stunned, the party was unable to move as they watched 7 of the blob-like spirits boil and merge and dance, until at last they seemed to form a gigantic spectral form. The air became thick, the fog turned red, and the childlike laughter faded and lowered into something deep and somehow distant and discordant. When all was done, a monstrous form floated before them. A spheroid shape dotted with over a dozen eyes, now disgustingly huge and bulging like polyps, all staring out in every direction. Its body was translucent and green, like spectral slime, and underneath parts of it shot out like spikes, darting about its underbelly, jittering madly before disappearing and reappearing. It held a terrifying aura of wrongness and death. Then, within, a light like a candle flame. It grew and grew, making the thing bulge and writhe to hold it. At last, with a high-pitched whistle, massive gouts of fire burst forth from every spike, bathing the room in intense blue flames. Everyone screamed in pain, including Bean.
H, help me up. I can't move,"
Medea yelled, from her position stuck behind the chest where she had fallen. Her legs had taken the worst of the fire, and they were the most poorly armored parts of her body too. Every jerk she made to get out was another wave of burning pain.
I'm coming,"
Chesney said through gritted teeth. His armor had protected him well, but all the gaps in his joints made every move a reminder of why little children should never play with fire. He grabbed Medea's hands and his heart broke as he heard her pained whimpers as he hefted her back to her feet. Bean's form was smoking, but it didn't stop him from squaring up in front of the creature and slashing at its great body with a practiced flurry of blows. The thing screamed, either in pain or anger, and small bits of it flaked away, dissolving into nothingness. In response, it paused for just a moment, filled its form with air, and then assailed them all with an impossibly high screech that sent their minds dizzy and their ears ringing.
"Off. Tea together. Come on, Chesney. That trick Wild taught me,"
Medea said, hoping he understood. He nodded, and they both shouted,
"Break!"
And two powerful whirls of shifting reality shot forth into the center of the thing. A hole was blasted through it, and its body almost seemed to be being sucked into a whirlpool. But to their dismay, hardly any of its body stayed gone, and it started to reform.
"Not good. Not good."
Chesney had time to yell, before another blast of fire engulfed the room once more, redoubling their agony.
We have to run,"
Medea cried.
"Run how? There's nowhere to go."
Chesney balked.
Just pick a hole and jump down. We need to get out of here."
The thought of leaping a dozen feet downwards while covered in burns made him want to retch, but he had no better solution.
"Okay, you two, go first. I'm right behind you."
He stumbled forward, giving the big boss ghost thing a target to focus on, while the others made their escape.
"All right, buddy. I can do fire too,"
he bellowed, then leveled his strongest fire spell he could muster at the being. 3 of the eyes burst and dissolved into nothingness. Then the thing spun and knocked him to the floor with its spikes, aggravating his wounds. Now that he saw his friends had made it below, he allowed the momentum to carry him close to a pit and rolled into it. Chesney crashed to the ground, and seconds later, Medea was propping him up.
"Come on, we need to keep moving."
From above them, the terrible blue fire illuminated the fog through the floorboards in slats of light and shadow. Choking on the pain, he got to his feet and looked around.
"Is there anything here?" "I think so. Over, in the far corner."
Above them the thing screeched once more, and it started to bubble through the floor above and stare at them with unnatural, intense polypus eyes. Though he was so bone-weary and in pain that he wanted to just fall down and sleep, he blasted the approaching ghost with a bolt of lightning instead, trying to keep it from fully entering the room.
"You check it out. I'll hold it back."
She staggered away, and Bean joined him. The ghostly blob thing didn't care in the least about his bolt of lightning, but bits of it did seem to break away and not reform. Bean performed an amazing leap and slashed away one of the spiky tendrils as well. Chesney almost made a quip about how active he was for a specter, but another high-pitched screech sent him to his knee, and a cough sent a stream of blood from his nose and mouth, splattering the inside of his visor.
"It's not the seeds,"
Medea yelled from across the room.
"Fine, head down again. I'll be right behind you. Bean, watch her back,"
he yelled, blasting the big boss ghost with a break spell. That time, another eye burst and didn't reform. By this time, it had fully entered the room, and Chesney tried to find his own way down. He staggered away from the thing to the sides of the room, but the light and fog made it impossible to see where any holes were. He could see the thing was building up to another explosion of fire.
"I can't find a way down."
There was shouting from below, but he couldn't make it out, and in desperation he cast a spell to reflect some of the magic away just in time. The explosion of fire knocked him back and into a wall, but when he fell, it was awkwardly into a set of loose boards. He slipped through, scraping his body against the splintered wood. When he hit the floor below, it was half into another pit. It knocked the wind out of him and sent him flipping end over through the air, until at last he collapsed on the bottom floor. Medea screamed, though he was dimly aware of it. There was more noise, and pain, and he couldn't concentrate, and it was so hard not to fall asleep. Breathing was agony, but he bit his own tongue to try and stay conscious. He slowly came to be more aware of his own body, and unquestionably he had broken a number of ribs. All his fight was draining away from him. Far down the hall to the southwest, he could see the open door to the relative safety of the dead outdoors. It seemed so impossibly far away, but he used a bloody hand to claw himself forward. A few moments later, a soft thud, and staggering footsteps. Medea.
I found them. The seeds we need to.
She began, but was interrupted with a groaning, rage-filled howl.
Get away from him,
she yelled, blasting it with 2 bolts. It screamed in response, and it felt like invisible razors were burrowing into their brain. Medea fell beside him, but was able to scramble to her feet.
Bean, help me carry him.
Her hands grabbed his blistered arm and tried to drag him to the exit. Bean mirrored her on the other side, and they began to drag him through the ground's rubble. His whole body was racked with pain, but it was distant, like it was happening to someone else. They'd not even made it halfway when they felt a strong wind, and then a tug trying to pull Chesney out of their hands. In the deep darkness of the tower, the enormous ghost had opened up, and in its center was some cold black emptiness that was drawing in everything in the room. Dust and sand, shattered wood splinters, and other detritus dragged across the floor, then took to the air and spiraled into the great maw.
Oh, gods!
Medea balked, understanding that it was trying to suck them all in it. Weak as they were, it was working. Chesney slipped a little out of Medea's slippery fingers.
No!
She staggered, and reaffixed her grip. Bean strained to pick up the slacker. The great pull of wind increased, and the air filled with an ear-piercing, endless scream as everything in the room was devoured by the enormous ghost. Chesney was almost lifting off the floor by the force of it, and Medea and Bean had to brace themselves at steep angles to remain upright. At last, disaster struck. Medea stepped on a loose shard of wood and slipped to the floor, and Chesney's arm slipped from her grasp. Bean held for another moment, but the pull was too great and fell over too, just able to hold on to something solid enough to stop him from being pulled away. Chesney, now freely being dragged back towards the horrible thing, could only barely turn to try and level a weak blast of fire, which was swallowed up and seemed to do nothing. There was nothing left in him. He could only watch as the great black maw loomed closer, and it was as though his very soul recoiled at the inevitable coming destruction. From somewhere, he heard a terrible crackling and scream that drowned out the howling, whipping winds. A shining thing made of light sailed through the air past him. In the next instant, everything turned white, and it felt as if the whole floor heaved beneath him. Seconds passed, and Chesney became aware that he had stopped moving, and he could hear heavy, shuddering breathing. Once his eyes and ears adjusted, he saw Medea standing a few feet away, between him and where the ghost had been. She was taking deep, gulping breaths, and held both hands out, palms together. Behind her, around her, and in a straight line in front of her were charged shadows into the floor, all leading towards the far eastern wall, which was no longer there, completely blown away, massive blocks blown into the dead sands outside. The ghost that had been there was gone without a trace. Then, her arms wavered, her knees buckled, and she fell to the floor. He, too, succumbed then, and he fell into unconsciousness. When he regained consciousness, he found himself lying in the deadly cold white sand just outside the doors of the black tower, with Medea quietly breathing beside him, eyes closed. Her body was covered in marks and smears and blood, but it seemed all her wounds had been closed. Once more, under the pale indistinct light of the sun, he felt no wind, and heard no sound. His throat felt scratchy, and it took him a moment to realize that there was a pill lodged there. He coughed and finished swallowing it before sitting up. It was still too bright for him after all his time in the dark tower, so he had to squint.
Ah, It is good to see you alive and awake, young child of Nasquat.
It was Bean's voice, odd and distant yet close. Chesney tried to speak, but had trouble finding his voice. The sound seemed to rouse Medea, who blinked awake, only to groan and turn in the sand and close her eyes once more.
Do we still have the seeds?
Chesney managed, looking up at Bean from the ground. The spectre nodded, pointing to a small bag on Medea's belt. Chesney reached over, took it, secured it in his armor.
Good. Let's get out of here.
He blearily felt around in his mind for the new spirits which gave him the ability to bend time and space and travel great distances, air and sky. It took him a minute to gather up the life, offer it up, and pinpoint that exactness that signaled that his destination was set. Glowing rings encircled them, slammed down a flash of light, and all trace of them in these wasted plains of death were at last no more. End of chapter.